Jeremy Corbyn has come after Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner on her plans to sell off allotments. Jeremy Corbyn has criticised Angela Rayner, the local government secretary, for rules that allow councils to sell allotments to fund day-to-day spending, saying it makes the future of these precious spaces even more perilous. Rules on council asset sales mean local authorities can sell off sites to help deliver transformation and investor-saved projects they would otherwise not be able to afford. Corbyn, writing for The Telegraph, said the possible sale of allotments would fill many with deep dismay. Allotments have always been under threat from developers. Now that threat seems to have government backing, which makes the future of these precious spaces even more perilous. Corbyn also took to Twitter and said this: "Is this government going to put the nail in the coffin of the joy of digging ground for potatoes on a cold, wet February Sunday afternoon? The battle for the grassroots is on." Now, look, this isn't just a story about drama. This speaks to the deeper issue of Labour. To me, this seems to be an obsession with continuing the Thatcherite economic policy, selling everything off. Jim McMahon, who is the Housing, Communities and Local Government Minister, said, "We know how important allotments are for communities, and this is why strict criteria is in place to protect them. The rules on the sale of assets have been in place since 2016, have not changed. Ministerial approvals for the sale of allotments in 2024 were lower than the average for recent years." Now, this is a bit confusing because Labour are saying they haven't changed the rules. Yet previously it was for local authorities to make the decisions on selling off spaces. Now ministers can do it. Now, the reason why they're doing this is due to many councils going bankrupt. You only need to look at Birmingham. The thing is, it's not the Tories in power anymore. Labour are in power, so they could give more funding to local councils. Ashok, what's your thoughts? I know for most people, the politics of allotments doesn't keep them up at night, but do you think this is another Thatcherite strategy of selling things off for a quick buck?
Look, at the local level, there are only regressive forms of taxation, right? So the only way you can generate revenue at a local level, anyone involved in local government knows this, council tax, which was a sweetener from the poll tax, which is highly regressive, means that it's like it disproportionately affects the poor. Fines, which are the most regressive forms of extracting, revenue. And there's business rates, which are set nationally, which are like not as regressive, but also potentially are passed on to consumers, but really they're not as regressive. There's no ability for local governments to extract revenue in a progressive way. So this is a way to basically try and, again, yes, sell off things that should be in the public interest. Because fundamentally what Rayner's trying to do, and Rayner's consistently does this in the most sort of crass and cynical way, is like she won't, when she would like get up and say some kind of like stereotypically kind of like she'd have an outburst in Parliament and then people would attack her. And it was such a like obvious way of trying to be like, to get her like working class bona fides without actually standing up for working class people. So then they'd be like, oh, she's being attacked because she's working class. Now, I'm not attacking her because of her working class background. What I'm saying is the way that you can stay true to your working class background is by actually taxing wealth, taxing the rich, taxing incomes at a higher level, distributing wealth more. Obviously, we know this. And they could easily do that. They could even borrow and give it into local communities, which will actually be spent, which will spur the economy and keep us away from a dangerous recession, because we know we're moving in that direction, obviously, because demand is falling, because there's less money in people's pockets. If you gave local governments, for example, the power to set rent controls, which even Sadiq Khan and others have backed to give local authorities the power to do rent controls, then you would actually have people have more money in their pockets, not being siphoned off by these massive institutional investors and landlords, institutional landlords who are now entering from the US, the market, siphoning it off like a parasite. So all it is like these cities where we're toiling endlessly and like a vortex, like a succubus. These landlords and these like institutional investors are just siphoning off half, 3/4 of our salaries for doing nothing, for literally having a roof over our shoulders. If we actually did rent controls, that money would go back into local communities, and actually we could get higher business rates. The greater the circulation, the more the tax revenue is, right? There are loads and loads of things that could be done that are actually progressive. Instead, this is culture war. They're saying, okay, allotments, that's what white middle class people do, which we know is nonsense, because actually loads of people who live in high density housing, the 7th, 8th, 10th, 11th floor of a building, who have no public space, This is their way to like actually have public space. I live in East London. I live in Tower Hamlets. The allotments are where loads of Bengali families and Somali families grow vegetables that you typically wouldn't get in markets here that are very important for our cuisine, right? So it's like the idea that this is some kind of middle class thing is only in the minds of people that don't live in major metropolitan cities, and it's in the minds of it's just a caricature, right? This is something that many working class people and people of color and working class people of color and just people need. That's why you have massive 7, 8, 9 year waiting lists in my neighborhood to have a spot in an allotment. They're hugely popular and they're in need. And so the thing is, there's this kind of setup where they say, "Oh, we want to meet people's like essential needs." I'm sorry, we want bread, but we want roses too. We want the ability to live, but we want the ability to exist as a community and like have greenery and not suffocate under smog. Cities, honestly, if you look at American cities, I grew up in Chicago. They're built on a grid, and there's no public spaces. There's really not that much parking space. Like in parks, in like New York, for example, you got Central Park, you got Prospect Park, you got like Marcus Garvey Park, etc. You got a handful of parks. You go to Chicago, you got a handful of Wicker Park, a few other parks, right? If you come to London, they're everywhere. Why? Because the city was built prior to the emergence of capitalism. Under capitalism, everything, like Marx says, you have Marx behind you, I've got Marx behind me. He says everything is reduced to the commodity form. Everything is mediated through the market. Everything is for exchange value. Nothing should be for use value. Like there's some utility that I have as a human being that isn't just mediated to the market, that isn't reduced to its commodity, right? Reduced to be like liquefied for the accumulation of capital. And so that's why parks, which are just where people should go to enjoy their lives, that's why parks don't exist in cities that are built just for capitalist accumulation. So allotments are part of that. Like it's not just some kind of thing that people do for fun. It's a necessity, and we have to actually treat it as an essential characteristic. And so instead of taxing the rich, instead of taxing corporations more, actually they're pushing for corporation tax to get lower than the Tories. They were attacking the Tories when Rishi Sunak was in power because they said the corporation tax is too low. Instead of doubling our defense budget, they should actually circulate. This is not good for the economy. They could actually get more money into local government. That circulates, that comes into the hands of poor people who actually spend that money, and that leads to growth. These people, and I'll end with this. Sorry if I'm talking too long, Curtis. The thing is, these people's model of growth, they constantly talk about growth. Growth, there's two forms of growth. There's like many forms of growth, but there's two forms of growth. There's supply side growth, which is this kind of neoclassical idea of what growth is, which is we need to get corporations to have more money who will then invest that money. In the real economy, there's not much growth. So if you get wealthy people and corporations more money, they're going to put it into credit default swaps. They're going to financialize it. They're going to put it into buying up more property and siphoning up more money and increasing rents from poor people, right? But then there's demand-led growth. So demand-led growth is, let's still talk about growth. I mean, there's a whole critique of growth, obviously. I mean, growth is also what might be killing us. But let's just talk in the paradigm they've said. We want growth. There's demand-led growth. You get more money into more people's hands rather than in some Cayman Island offshore account. And you get more money into more people's hands. That circulates up and down the country, and that leads to demand-led growth. So there's supply side, which is at the point of production, and there's demand side, which is at the point of consumption. Demand, supply. And you say we get more money at the point of consumption through taxing the rich and through progressive forms of taxation, and that actually leads to greater outcomes even in the paradigm that they've set up about growth.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that point about growth because I mean, it's so true. The way the mainstream media and politicians talk about growth, it's like this. It's this one thing, and I use this example. Like the way politicians measure growth, it's kind of like buying a pair of trousers, and you're looking at the length and not the width. It doesn't tell the full story. In fact, the way the media looks at growth is basically on corporate profits. A lot of growth is also consumer debt. Just if you're in debt to a bank or these days Klarna is with everything, private companies, looks good on the profits, doesn't mean that the average person is richer. Supply side growth is I mean, I have my problems with growth too in terms of analyzing the economy that way, but I think it's at least another dimension to look at the health of the economy and the health of the average person. I also appreciate when talking about allotments, you managed to get some Marxist theory in there. I've got a lot of time for that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a very good point that a lot of people think that this is a sort of middle class sort of thing to do. But actually, no, working class communities use allotments, and there's a lot of use value from it. They're trying to get their exchange value, obviously, because they have to raise the funds for councils. The point I was making earlier is that it's no longer the Tories in power who are setting the budgets for the councils. Labour in power, they could just give councils more money so they don't have to sell it off. And I suppose one might say, I mean, this is not something I particularly agree with, right? But because I think selling off to private developers does not sit right with me. But if these developers are to build housing, at least more houses are getting built. Given that we're in a housing crisis, could some good come out of this? I know it's selling off spaces that they shouldn't do, but if it meant there was more housing, could that be like a positive from a bad situation?
The thing about it is there's this whole this is a whole bigger debate about housing stock. We need to build more. We need to build more. Undeniably, building more would be a positive. Absolutely. I'm not denying that at all. The point is that that isn't the solution in itself. And I'm sure you've had discussions and debates about this before. Actually building up by monopolistic buyers is what you're seeing now. It's not little mom and pop people selling one place or two places. It's these massive buyers buying huge amounts of rental properties and elevating the price to a certain amount. So that means that when you have monopoly like buyers, or what Kalecki calls a high degree of monopoly power. So it's not like they're not monopolies, because you don't really have pure monopolies other than natural monopolies, but huge landlords, institutional buyers that can set prices, and there's a social condition in which they set those prices. What that then results in is no matter how many more you build, they're not going below that threshold, right? And so the argument that all you have to do is build more simply does not add up. And this is why I'm a big advocate of rent controls. And the reason why I think rent controls are important, and even though housing prices and land prices have technically fallen now, what you do, if you set, let's say we set rent controls, for example, what that does is it means that the property values go down. Once property values go down, you've decommodified housing. It makes it so that councils can also buy property much easier. It also makes it that this rent-seeking constituency, this constituency of an enormous amount of power, so landlords, developers, etc., who have and people from the City of London, financiers, they don't feel the need to capture the state as much, because everything isn't mediated through housing prices. So when housing prices are through the roof, they have captured councils. It's deeply corrupt. They're pushing the council to sell off lands at cut rate prices. They're pushing the council to sell off some, there's an allotment near my house. It's like 90% Bengali aunties. They don't have much power. Some ghoul from the City of London, which we neighbor, will be like pushing the council. I mean, our council is very left wing and wouldn't do that. But when it was run by the Labour Party a few years ago, it was hugely corrupt. They would just push them, and they would push them off the land. You give these local authorities enough power to do that, there's a lot of state capture. So if I'm flying all over the place, but let's say you introduce rent controls, what we see happen time and time again is slowly what that leads to, it puts caps on the profitability of housing. Once you set caps on the profitability of housing, it snowballs to allow for the decommodification of housing. It means that we don't see housing as a commodity. We see housing as a need. That's why, like in Britain all the time, when someone buys a house and it's the house they live in, it's their only house, they'll be like, my property. I'm like, why are you calling it your property? It's your home. Stop calling it your property. Like, there's this thing in Britain where everything's like a property. I'm like, it's not your property, it's your home. And that's part of the language of commodification of the housing market. So it's like, if you put caps on it, then the housing prices and the value of housing as a commodity goes down. And councils, especially progressive councils like, Wandsworth and Islington and Tower Hamlets and other places, can actually buy those houses and build public housing on it. And it reduces, if we see the battle in society between, let's just say, be reductive here and say it's labor and capital. If we reduce the power of capital, it's like trench warfare. We reduce the profits of capital, we reduce the power of capital, we erode the self-interest of capital, we reduce the power as a vested interest of capital, then we can embolden and bolster the power of labor. And that's, by labor, I mean tenants and not the people who work and earn a living, not earn their living off of other people's labor. So I think the problem is, if you even look at London, actually housing prices have come down for a number of reasons. High interest rates, non-dom status going away, like a number of, even the renters bill has made it so it's not as profitable as before. So if we did say something like rent controls, these kinds of questions of selling off council property, doesn't go away completely, but it reduces it significantly because now a builder, since 2017, since Brexit, building costs are enormous. Back in the day, before 2017, people would be like, I want to buy a house in London and other places, buy a house that needs a lot of work because housing prices were high, but building costs were low. Whereas now, for the past 6-7 months to a year and for the next year, housing prices have gone down, but building costs have gone up. So even if you introduce things that put limits on it, these questions wouldn't even come into, not that they would never come into the question of like housing prices being valuable or not being valuable, but it would just make it so it would be much more difficult to have this, really state capture to try and like turn allotments and parks and other things that should be for people's use into a means of exchange.
Support independent media, support social justice that's there on social media. Thank you. Turn left.